The storm hit us like a freight train somewhere in the Gulf of Alaska, waves tall as buildings crashing over the bow of our cargo ship. I'd been working these waters for 3 years, but I'd never seen anything like this. The deck pitched and rolled so hard I had to grip the safety lines just to stay upright. Ted Kowalski was working the port side, securing loose equipment before it could slide overboard. He'd been on the crew longer than me, a solid guy, always ready with a joke or a story about his kids back in Seattle. I watched him wrestling with a cargo net that had come loose, the wind whipping his rain gear around like a flag. That's when the ship lurched hard to starboard. I saw Ted lose his footing, his boots sliding on the wet deck. He grabbed for the railing, but his gloves were soaked and his hands slipped right off the metal. 1 second he was there, fighting to stay upright, and the next he was gone, swept over the side by a wave that must have been 30 feet high. "Man overboard!" I screamed into the wind, but my voice got swallowed by the storm. I ran toward the bridge, slipping and sliding on the deck, my heart hammering in my chest. "Man overboard! Port side!" Captain William Hayes appeared on the bridge wing, his face grim as he surveyed the churning water. He was a tall man with graying hair plastered to his skull by the rain. His cold blue eyes scanned the waves. "Where?" he shouted down at me. I pointed to where I'd last seen Ted. The water was black and violent, foam and spray making it impossible to see anything clearly. But then I caught a glimpse of orange, Ted's life vest bobbing in the waves about 50 yards off our port beam. "There! I can see his vest!" Captain Hayes barked orders to the crew. James Patterson and Michael Torres appeared on deck, both of them moving carefully along the safety lines. Robert Chen emerged from below, carrying life rings and rope. Paul Rodriguez took position at the stern with a boat hook. The captain maneuvered the ship as close as he dared to Ted's position. In these seas, getting too close meant risking the hull against the waves, but staying too far meant losing Ted to the current. I could see him in the water, arms flailing as he tried to stay afloat. The life vest was keeping him up, but barely. "Throw the ring," Captain Hayes commanded. Michael hurled a life ring attached to a long rope. The first throw fell short, the wind catching it and blowing it off course. James grabbed another ring and tried again. This one landed closer, but Ted couldn't reach it. The waves kept pushing him away from the ship. 20 minutes. That's how long Ted was in that freezing water. 20 minutes of watching him fight to stay alive while we fought to get close enough to pull him out. The water temperature couldn't have been more than 40 degrees. Hypothermia should have killed him in half that time. Finally, Paul managed to snag Ted with the boat hook, grabbing onto his life vest and pulling him close enough for the rest of us to haul him up. We dragged him over the railing and onto the deck, where he collapsed in a heap of soaked clothing and chattering teeth. Except he wasn't chattering. I knelt beside him, expecting to find him shivering uncontrollably, maybe unconscious from the cold. Instead, Ted just lay there, perfectly still, staring up at the gray sky with wide, unblinking eyes. His skin was pale, almost gray, but he wasn't shaking at all. "Ted?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "You okay, man?" He turned his head toward me in jerky mechanical motions like his neck had gears instead of muscles. When his eyes met mine, something cold crawled up my spine. They were the same brown eyes I'd known for months, but something different sat behind them. Something empty. "Cold," he said. Just that one word spoken in a flat monotone. "Yeah, I bet. Let's get you below deck, get you warmed up." I helped him to his feet, and that's when I really noticed how wrong his movements were. Ted had always been smooth and coordinated. You had to be, working on a ship. But now he moved like a marionette, all sharp angles and sudden stops. When he walked, his legs seemed to move independently of each other, like he was learning how to use them for the first time. The other crew members gathered around, all of them looking relieved but puzzled. James kept running his hands through his red hair, a nervous habit of his. "Jesus, Ted, we thought you were done for." James said, his Irish accent thick with emotion. 20 minutes in that water. Ted turned toward James with that same mechanical head movement. Done, he said. That was it. Just done. No explanation, no gratitude, no relief at being alive. James frowned and looked at me, clearly confused. Maybe he's in shock, Michael suggested, adjusting his bandana under his work cap. That water was cold enough to freeze your brain. But I'd seen shock before, and this wasn't it. Shock made people disoriented, confused, sometimes delirious. Ted wasn't confused, he was just different. Like something fundamental about him had changed during those 20 minutes in the water. We got him below deck and into dry clothes. Robert Chen brought him hot coffee and a blanket, but Ted just sat on his bunk staring straight ahead. He'd take a sip of coffee when someone told him to, but otherwise he didn't move. Didn't speak unless someone asked him a direct question, and even then his answers were single words. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Fine." "Are you warm enough?" "Yes." "Do you remember falling overboard?" "Water." That was the extent of our conversation. The Ted I knew would have been telling the story already, describing what it felt like to hit that freezing water, maybe making jokes about how he'd thought he was going to become fish food. This Ted just sat there like a statue. The storm passed during the night, leaving us with calm seas and clear skies. I was on deck the next morning checking for damage from the rough weather when Captain Hayes called my name from the bridge. "Morrison, my office. Now." I climbed the stairs to the bridge level and knocked on the captain's door. His office was small but organized. Charts rolled and stored, his uniform jacket hanging on a hook with the brass buttons aligned. Captain Hayes sat behind his desk, his large, calloused hands folded in front of him. "Close the door," he said. I did, then stood at attention. Hayes had been in the Merchant Marine for over 30 years, and he ran his ship with military precision. You didn't slouch or lean against the wall in his presence. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a piece of paper, handwritten in careful block letters. He slid it across the desk toward me. "Read this," he said. "Memorize it. Follow it exactly." I picked up the paper. At the top, in Hayes's precise handwriting, were the words, "Ship rules, mandatory compliance." Below that were 5 numbered items. 1. If someone falls overboard, do not attempt rescue. Report to bridge immediately. 2. Do not approach the stern between sunset and sunrise. 3. Do not touch or open any cargo containers without direct authorization. 4. If red light appears on bridge, go below deck immediately and remain there until morning. 5. Never enter captain's cabin under any circumstances. I read through the list twice, my confusion growing with each line. "Captain, I don't understand. We just rescued Ted yesterday. Are you saying we shouldn't have—" "The ocean sometimes returns things that weren't meant to come back," Hayes interrupted, staring at me. "These rules will keep you alive, Morrison. Follow them exactly, or you'll end up like the others." "What others?" Hayes clasped his hands behind his back. "The crew members who didn't follow the rules. The ones who thought they knew better than the sea." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Captain, what are you talking about? What's wrong with Ted?" "Nothing's wrong with Ted," Hayes said, but his voice carried a weight that suggested otherwise. "Ted is exactly what the ocean wanted him to be. The question is whether you're smart enough to stay out of its way." I looked down at the paper again, the words seeming to shift and blur in front of my eyes. "These rules, how long have you been using them?" "Long enough to know they work." Hayes moved to the window, gazing out at the calm water. "This ship has been running these routes for 15 years, Morrison. Do you know how many crew members we've lost to accidents in that time?" I shook my head. "None. 0. Not a single man lost to the sea, as long as everyone follows the rules." He turned back to me, his weathered face serious. But the moment someone decides the rules don't apply to them, the moment they think they can outsmart what's down there in the deep water, and that's when people disappear. But Ted didn't disappear, we pulled him out. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Did we? The question hung in the air like smoke. I thought about Ted's mechanical movements, his empty stare, the way he'd spoken in single words, the way he'd survived 20 minutes in water that should have killed him in 5. I want you to watch him, Hayes continued. Watch how he moves, how he talks, how he interacts with the other crew members. Then tell me if you think we pulled the same Ted Kowalski out of that water that we lost. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket, my hands trembling slightly. What am I supposed to do with this? Follow the rules. All of them. Exactly as written. Hayes returned to his desk, effectively dismissing me. And Morrison, don't share those rules with anyone else. They're for you alone. I left his office with more questions than answers, the paper feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in my pocket. As I walked back toward the crew quarters, I passed Ted standing near the port railing, staring out at the water. He was perfectly motionless, not even swaying with the gentle roll of the ship. "Morning, Ted," I said. He turned toward me with that same jerky motion, his dark eyes focusing on my face. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind them. Recognition, maybe, or awareness. But then it was gone, replaced by that empty stare. "Morning," he said in his flat monotone. I waited for him to say something else, to ask about the weather or complain about the coffee or make some joke about his swim yesterday. But he just turned back to the water and resumed his motionless vigil. The rules in my pocket seemed to burn against my leg as I walked away, Captain Hayes' words echoing in my mind. The ocean sometimes returns things that weren't meant to come back. I spent the rest of the morning watching Ted from a distance, and what I saw made my stomach turn. He moved through his duties like a sleepwalker, performing each task with mechanical precision, but no awareness of his surroundings. When James tried to start a conversation with him, Ted just stared until James gave up and walked away. When Michael offered him a sandwich at lunch, Ted took it, but never ate it, just held it in his hands until it fell apart. But the worst part was the way he watched us. Whenever he thought no one was looking, Ted would turn his head and stare at one of the crew members with those empty eyes. He'd track their movements across the deck like a predator studying prey, his head moving in small, precise increments to follow their path. By evening, I'd made my decision. Whatever had come back from the ocean wearing Ted's face, it wasn't Ted Kowalski. And if Captain Hayes' rules were the only thing standing between me and whatever fate had befallen my friend, then I was going to follow them to the letter. I settled back into my routine the next morning, but keeping an eye on Ted had become like watching a predator in a zoo. The first thing I noticed was how the other crew members had started avoiding him completely. James would be working on the port side, and if Ted wandered over, James would find urgent business somewhere else. Michael stopped telling his usual stories when Ted was around, just went quiet and focused on his work with that nervous energy people get when they know they're being watched. Robert had taken to eating his meals, standing up by the galley door instead of sitting at the table, ready to bolt if Ted showed up. Paul kept checking over his shoulder every minute, and I caught him muttering prayers in Spanish under his breath when he thought nobody was listening. Ted didn't seem to care that everyone was avoiding him. If anything, it made him more persistent. He'd follow James around the deck, staying about 10 feet behind him, matching his pace exactly. When James would stop to adjust a line or check equipment, Ted would stop too, just standing there with his hands at his sides, watching. I saw Michael try to talk to him once, asking if he needed help with something. Ted just stared at him for a long moment, then said no, in that flat monotone, and kept following him. Michael's face went pale and he practically jogged to the other end of the ship. The worst part was how Ted moved now. Before he went overboard, Ted had this easy way of walking, rolling with the ship's motion like all of us had learned to do. Now he walked like he was fighting the deck, taking these deliberate steps that didn't match the ship's rhythm at all. His head would turn in these quick, jerky movements, like a bird tracking movement, and he never seemed to blink. By the third day, the whole crew was on edge. Nobody wanted to work alone anymore. Paul and Robert started doing everything in pairs, even simple jobs that only needed one person. Michael began volunteering for the early morning shifts just to avoid being on deck when Ted was around. I was coming off my afternoon watch when Captain Hayes called me to the bridge. He was standing at the chart table, but his eyes were on the deck below where Ted was following James around the winch housing. "Notice anything different about the crew dynamics, Morrison?" he asked without looking at me. "They're scared of him," I said. "Smart men." Hayes clasped his hands behind his back. "Fear keeps them alive. The thing wearing Kowalski's face is learning their patterns, their habits. It's studying them." I watched Ted stop when James stopped, start when James started. Studying them for what? Hayes finally looked at me. "That's not your concern. Your concern is following the rules and staying alive. The crew will adapt or they won't." That night I drew the first watch, midnight to 4 in the morning. The ship was quiet except for the engine's steady rumble and the sound of water against the hull. Most of the crew was asleep, and Ted had disappeared somewhere below deck around 10 o'clock. I was checking the port side rigging when I heard it, someone calling my name from the stern. "Daniel?" The voice was clear as day, cutting through the engine noise and the wind. I froze, my hands still gripping the safety line. "Daniel, over here." I knew that voice. I'd grown up hearing it every day for 18 years, heard it calling me for dinner, telling me to hurry up, laughing at my stupid jokes. It was Marcus, my brother who drowned in a fishing accident 2 years ago off the coast of Maine. My feet started moving toward the stern before I could stop them. The voice was coming from the water, just beyond the ship's wake. "Daniel, I've been waiting for you." I made it halfway to the stern before Captain Hayes' words hit me like a slap. The ocean returns things that weren't meant to come back. Rule number 2, no stern approach between sunset and sunrise. I stopped walking and forced myself to look away from the water. My hands were shaking as I gripped the nearest railing. "Daniel, don't leave me again." The voice was closer now, like Marcus was right there at the stern, maybe even climbing up the side of the ship. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to look, to help him. He was my brother. He'd been my best friend. How could I just walk away? But I remembered Ted's gray skin and mechanical movements, the way he stared without blinking. I remembered Captain Hayes washing blood off his hands. Whatever was calling my name from the water, it wasn't Marcus. I turned my back on the stern and headed for the crew quarters below deck. The voice followed me. "Daniel, please, I'm so cold." I kept walking, my boots loud on the metal stairs. "Daniel, why won't you help me?" I made it to the crew quarters and shut the door behind me. The voice was muffled now, but I could still hear it calling my name, over and over. I sat on my bunk and put my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my head. For the next hour, Marcus kept calling. Sometimes he sounded desperate, sometimes angry, sometimes like he was crying. He told me he missed me, that he was sorry for the fight we'd had before he died, that he just wanted to see me one more time. Every word was like a knife in my chest, but I stayed in that bunk and didn't move. Finally, around 2 in the morning, the voice stopped. I finished my watch in the crew quarters, checking the time every few minutes until 4 o'clock came and Paul showed up to relieve me. I didn't tell him what had happened. I just handed over the watch and tried to get some sleep. The next evening, I was doing a routine check of the cargo containers when I found James standing in front of one of them, pressed up against the metal door with his ear flat against the surface. "James," I called out, but he didn't respond. I walked over and could hear what had his attention. scratching sounds coming from inside the container like something with claws was trying to get out. The sounds were rhythmic, deliberate, like whatever was inside was working at the metal. "James," I said again, louder this time. He still didn't respond. His eyes were wide and unfocused, like he was sleepwalking. The scratching sounds got louder, more urgent, and James pressed his ear harder against the door. I grabbed his shoulder and pulled him away from the container. He resisted at first, trying to get back to the door, but I kept pulling until he stumbled backward and seemed to snap out of whatever trance he'd been in. "What?" He looked around, confused. "What am I doing here?" "You were listening to something in the container," I said. James looked at the metal door, then back at me. "I don't remember coming here. I was in the galley getting coffee, and then..." He shook his head. "I can't remember." The scratching sounds had stopped as soon as I'd pulled him away. Now the container was silent. "What was I listening to?" James asked. "I don't know," I lied. "Come on, let's get back to the crew quarters." I walked him back to the main deck, staying between him and the containers. James kept looking back over his shoulder, like he was trying to remember something important that was just out of reach. When we got to the crew quarters, James sat on his bunk and rubbed his temples. "My head feels fuzzy, like I've been drinking, but I haven't had anything since yesterday." "Maybe you're coming down with something," I said. "Maybe." He looked up at me. "Daniel, have you noticed anything strange about this ship?" I thought about the rules in my pocket, about Ted's mechanical movements, about Marcus's voice calling from the stern. "What do you mean?" "I keep having these dreams where I'm walking around the ship at night, but I can't remember where I'm going or why. And sometimes I wake up and my feet are dirty like I've been walking around outside." He held up his hands. "Look at my fingernails. They were black with grime, like he'd been clawing at something metal." "James, listen to me," I said. "If you ever feel like you're not in control, like something's making you do things you don't want to do, you need to fight it. Whatever's happening on this ship, you need to stay yourself." He nodded slowly. "There's something wrong here, isn't there?" "Yeah," I said. "There is." James lay back on his bunk and closed his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. But his hands kept twitching like he was scratching at something in his dreams. I sat on my own bunk and watched him sleep, wondering how long it would be before whatever had gotten to Ted started working on the rest of us. The scratching sounds from the container played over and over in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside those metal boxes was very much alive and very hungry. I was checking the port side rigging when I saw it, that red light on the bridge, glowing against the dark sky. 3 days had passed since James had been found at the containers. 3 days of watching Ted's movements and sensing the crew's fear spread through the ship. The rules were clear. Red light meant go below deck until morning. No exceptions. I dropped the rope I'd been inspecting and headed for the crew quarters. The red light made the familiar ship feel alien and threatening. I could feel it watching me as I walked, that mechanical presence that had once been Ted Kowalski. The crew quarters were empty when I arrived. James was probably still on his watch, and Michael had taken the late shift in the engine room. I climbed into my bunk and pulled the thin blanket up to my chest, staring at the ceiling and listening to the ship's usual creaks and groans. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy boots on the deck above, moving with purpose across the metal plating. Not the random wandering of a night watch. These steps had direction, intention. They moved from the bridge toward the stern, then back again, following a pattern I couldn't quite figure out. The dragging sounds started about 20 minutes later, something heavy being pulled across the deck, metal scraping against metal with a grinding noise that made my teeth ache. It would drag for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. Like someone was having trouble moving whatever it was, or maybe taking breaks to rest. I pressed my ear to the bulkhead, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The dragging continued, accompanied by those deliberate footsteps. Sometimes there were 2 sets of boots, sometimes 3. They moved back and forth across the deck above me, from bow to stern and back again. A thud echoed through the ship's hull, followed by what sounded like something heavy hitting the water. Then silence for maybe 10 minutes before the dragging started again. I lay there in the dark, counting the sounds. Drag, pause, footsteps, drag again. The pattern repeated for what felt like hours. My watch showed it was past midnight when the noises finally stopped, leaving only the normal sounds of the ship cutting through the water. Sleep didn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear those dragging sounds or footsteps in the corridor outside. When I finally slept, I dreamed of heavy things being pulled across metal decks while red light turned everything the color of blood. Morning came gray and cold, with a wind that cut through my jacket as I climbed up to the main deck. The red light was gone, and everything looked normal in the pale dawn light. Too normal, like someone had carefully arranged it all to look innocent. I was heading toward the galley when I saw Captain Hayes near the bridge. He was bent over a metal bucket, washing his arms with seawater. His uniform shirt was soaked, and dark stains covered the front of it. As I got closer, I could see the stains were red. Blood. Fresh blood. Hayes looked up when he heard my footsteps. His face was calm, almost peaceful, like he'd just finished some routine maintenance task. Water dripped from his hands as he straightened up. "Morning, Morrison," he said, his voice carrying that same authoritative tone it always had. "Sleep well?" I stared at the blood on his shirt, at the pink water in the bucket where he'd been washing. "What happened, Captain?" Hayes followed my gaze down to his shirt, then back to my face. "Lost Chen during the night. Fell overboard around 0200 hours, couldn't recover him." The words stopped me cold. Robert Chen, quiet, hard-working Robert, who always volunteered for the difficult shifts. Fell overboard? Storm came up sudden. Big wave took him right off the deck. Hayes dunked his hands in the bucket again, scrubbing at something under his fingernails. "These things happen at sea, Morrison. You know that." I looked around the deck. The morning was calm, with barely a breeze stirring the water. No sign of any storm, recent or otherwise. The deck was dry except where Hayes had spilled his washing water. "Where's the rest of the crew?" I asked. "James is in the engine room. Torres is checking the forward holds." Hayes lifted the bucket and dumped the bloody water over the side. "Why don't you do a head count, Morrison? Make sure everyone's accounted for." I found James first, exactly where Hayes had said he'd be. He looked up from the engine gauges when I appeared, his face drawn and tired. "You hear about Chen?" he asked. "Hayes told me. You see it happen?" James shook his head. "Was down here all night. Heard some noise on deck around 2, but figured it was just the watch doing their rounds." Michael was in the forward hold checking cargo tie-downs. When I asked about Chen, he got that same hollow look James had worn. "Captain told me this morning," Michael said. "Said he went overboard during my sleep shift. Didn't hear nothing, though. Usually you hear someone calling for help, you know." That made 3 of us who hadn't heard any calls for help. No man overboard shouts, no emergency signals, nothing. Just Robert Chen disappearing into the night while the rest of us slept. I counted heads as I made my way back to the main deck, James, Michael, myself. That left Ted, who I found standing at the port railing in his usual spot, staring out at the water with those unblinking eyes. 4 crew members left, including myself, down from 7 when we'd started this voyage. But Ted was still here. Ted who'd been pulled from the ocean and come back wrong. Ted who followed crew members around like he was studying them. Ted who'd been on deck during Chen's supposed accident. I watched him from across the deck, noting how still he stood, how his head never moved to track the seabirds or follow the waves. Just that fixed stare at the water, like he was waiting for something to surface. The pieces started falling into place in my mind. Hayes washing blood off his hands. No distress calls during Chen's disappearance. The dragging sounds I'd heard during the night. And Ted, always Ted, present for every incident but never affected by whatever was taking the crew. Hayes wasn't protecting us from supernatural threats. He was part of them. The following week passed in a haze of routine work and growing suspicion. I watched Hayes more carefully now, noting how he moved around the ship, where he went during his off hours. The man followed patterns, just like everyone else, and those patterns were starting to make sense. He spent a lot of time near the cargo containers. I was coiling rope near the winch housing when I saw them together. Hayes and Ted standing between two of the large metal boxes. They weren't talking exactly. Hayes would say something in a low voice, and Ted would respond with one of his flat, single-word answers. But there was something coordinated about it, like they were following a script they'd rehearsed. Hayes pulled a key ring from his belt and approached one of the containers. The lock was heavy, military grade, the kind that would take serious tools to break, but it opened easily under Hayes's key. The container door swung open with a metallic groan. I couldn't see inside from my position, but Hayes gestured toward the opening like he was inviting Ted to enter. And Ted did. He walked into that container like he belonged there, disappearing into the dark interior without hesitation. Hayes stood guard outside for a moment, looking around the deck to make sure no one was watching. His gaze passed right over me, but I was hidden behind the winch housing, just another shadow among the ship's machinery. Hayes closed the container door, but didn't lock it. Then he walked away, leaving Ted inside that metal box like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stayed hidden until Hayes disappeared into the bridge, then crept closer to the container. The metal was warm under my hand when I pressed my ear against it, and I could hear movement inside. Not the random scratching James had described, but deliberate sounds, like someone rearranging things, organizing them. The lock hung open on its hasp, just waiting for someone to secure. The scratching started before dawn, and didn't stop. I'd been lying in my bunk for 3 hours, listening to the rhythmic clawing sounds coming from above deck. Metal on metal, deliberate and constant, like something was trying to dig its way out of that container. Ted had climbed inside yesterday evening, and the sounds had been going ever since. I rolled over and checked my watch. 6:30 in the morning. The scratching had been going for at least 8 hours straight. James stirred in the bunk across from me, his eyes opening slowly. "You hear that?" "Hard not to," I said, sitting up. The sound was louder now, more urgent. Whatever was making it had been at it all night without stopping. James swung his legs over the side of his bunk and rubbed his face. "Sounds like it's coming from the containers." I nodded, but didn't tell him what I'd seen yesterday. Hayes and Ted at the container, the open lock, Ted disappearing inside. The scratching had started right after Hayes walked away. We got dressed and headed up to the main deck. The morning air was cold and damp, with fog rolling in from the north. The scratching was definitely coming from the same container I'd watched Ted enter. The sound echoed across the empty deck, sharp and metallic. Michael was already up, standing near the galley entrance with a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. "Been going all night," he said when he saw us. "Kept me awake." "What do you think it is?" James asked. Michael shrugged. "Cargo shifting around, maybe. Storms coming in from the west." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Cargo didn't scratch like that. Cargo didn't make deliberate rhythmic sounds that went on for hours without stopping. The scratching stopped. The silence pressed down harder than the noise had. We stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see if it would start again. When it didn't, Michael finished his coffee and headed toward the engine room. James went to check the rigging on the port side. I stayed where I was, watching the container. Around noon, the door opened. Ted emerged slowly, his movements more mechanical than before. But something was different about him now. His skin had turned grayish, like old meat left too long in the sun. His clothes hung loose on his frame, as if he'd lost weight overnight. He stood next to the container for a long moment, staring at nothing. Then his head turned toward me with that same jerky, bird-like motion I'd seen before. His eyes were completely black now, no white showing at all. "Ted," I called out, testing. He turned his whole body to face me, the movement sharp and unnatural. "Done," he said in that flat monotone. I walked closer to get a better look at him. His skin wasn't just gray. It had a waxy quality like old candle wax. A sweet, rotten smell came off him that made my stomach turn. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said, but his voice sounded different. Hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I backed off and went to find the others. James was still working on the rigging, and Michael was in the engine room checking the oil levels. Paul was on the bridge with Hayes going over the navigation charts. The day passed slowly. Ted wandered around the ship like he always did, but now his feet barely touched the deck when he walked. That smell followed him everywhere. Sweet decay that made everyone avoid him even more than before. Michael was on watch that night. I was in my bunk around midnight when I heard footsteps on deck above me, heavy boots moving back and forth near the containers. Then silence. I waited for Michael to come down for his break, but he never did. At 4 a.m, Paul went up to relieve him, and I heard voices on deck, raised voices, then nothing. Paul came down to the crew quarters 20 minutes later, his face pale. "Michael's gone," he said. "Can't find him anywhere." We searched the ship from bow to stern. Michael's coffee cup was still sitting on the bridge, half full and still warm. His jacket was hanging on a hook in the engine room, but Michael himself was nowhere to be found. Hayes called us together on the main deck as the sun came up. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his uniform perfectly pressed despite the early hour. "Crew member Torres fell overboard during his watch," he announced. "Rough seas, no distress call. We couldn't mount a rescue operation in time." I looked around at the water. It was calm as glass, barely a ripple on the surface. No rough seas anywhere. "When?" James asked. "Approximately 0200 hours, Hayes said. The watch change was delayed due to the incident. But I'd been awake at 2 a.m. I'd heard the footsteps on deck, the voices. No one had called man overboard. No one had sounded the alarm, and the seas had been calm all night." James looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but Hayes dismissed us before he could speak. We went back to our duties, but the mood on the ship had changed. 3 crew members gone in less than 2 weeks, and Hayes' explanations were getting thinner each time. I spent the day thinking about those rules Hayes had given me. No rescue attempts for overboard crew. Don't approach the stern at night. Don't touch the cargo containers. If the red light appears, go below deck. I'd thought the rules were meant to protect us from whatever was wrong with the ship, but now I was starting to think they served a different purpose. They weren't protecting the crew from supernatural threats. They were helping Hayes hide his involvement in the disappearances. The scratching started again that evening, right after Ted climbed back into the container. The same rhythmic clawing sounds, metal on metal, going on and on without stopping. Paul was on watch that night. I lay in my bunk listening to the scratching and thinking about Michael's empty coffee cup, still warm when we found it, about Robert Chen's blood on Hayes' uniform, about the voices I'd heard on deck before Paul came down to tell us Michael was gone. Around 11 o'clock, I saw the red light come on. It glowed against the darkness outside the porthole, casting everything in the crew quarters in a bloody hue. According to the rules, I was supposed to stay below deck until morning, but I'd followed the rules for 10 days now, and crew members kept disappearing anyway. I got dressed quietly and slipped out of the crew quarters. The corridor was empty, lit only by the emergency lighting along the walls. I made my way up to the main deck, staying low and keeping to the shadows. The red light was coming from the bridge, bright enough to see by. I crept toward the bow and hid behind one of the lifeboats, where I had a clear view of the bridge and most of the deck. Hayes came out of the bridge a few minutes later. He wasn't alone. Ted was with him, moving with that same gliding walk. But there was a third figure, someone I couldn't see clearly in the red light. They were shorter than Hayes, wearing what looked like crew clothes, but something was wrong with the way they moved. Too stiff, too mechanical. The three of them walked toward the stern, Hayes in the lead. I crept along behind the lifeboats, trying to get a better look at the third figure. As they passed under one of the deck lights, I caught a glimpse of the face. It was Robert Chen. But Robert was supposed to be dead, fallen overboard 3 days ago. This thing wearing his face had the same grayish skin as Ted, the same waxy quality, and it jerked forward in stuttering steps, arms swinging loose at the joints. They reached the stern and stopped near the railing. Hayes said something I couldn't hear, and Ted and the thing that looked like Robert moved to either side of him. Then I heard splashing sounds from the water below and what sounded like a struggle. Someone was fighting down there, thrashing in the water, trying to get away from something. The sounds went on for several minutes before they stopped abruptly. Hayes and his companions stood at the railing for a while longer, looking down at the water. Then they turned and walked back toward the bridge, passing close enough to my hiding spot that I could smell that sweet, rotten odor coming off both Ted and the Robert thing. I stayed hidden until the red light went out, then crept back to the crew quarters. Paul's bunk was empty. He was supposed to be on watch, but I had a feeling he wouldn't be coming back. The next morning, Hayes gathered us on deck again. Only James and I were left now, plus Hayes himself and whatever Ted had become. Crew member Rodriguez fell overboard during his watch, Hayes announced. Rough seas, no distress call. We couldn't mount a rescue operation in time. I looked at James. He was staring at Hayes with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The water was calm again, just like it had been when Michael disappeared. "That's 4 men," James said quietly. 4 men in 2 weeks. Hayes' expression didn't change. "The ocean is dangerous, Patterson. That's why we have rules." But I wasn't listening to his explanation anymore. I was counting. Hayes, myself, James, and Ted. 4 crew members left from the original 7, and I was pretty sure Ted didn't count as human anymore. I needed to find out what was inside those cargo containers. Whatever Hayes was hiding there, it was connected to the disappearances, the scratching sounds, Ted's transformation, the things I'd seen at the stern. It all led back to those containers. The scratching started again as soon as Ted climbed back inside. I stood on deck listening to it, watching the container door that Hayes had left unlocked. The sound was different now, more urgent, like whatever was in there was getting ready for something. I waited until Captain Hayes disappeared into the bridge, hunched over his navigation charts with that intense focus he got when plotting our course. The scratching from the containers had stopped an hour ago, which meant Ted was probably done with whatever he'd been doing in there. This was my chance. I crossed the deck, glancing toward Hayes' position. The container sat there, its door slightly ajar just like Hayes had left it. The lock hung open on its hasp, swaying with the ship's motion. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. The door opened with a soft creak. I stepped inside and the smell made my stomach lurch, sweet decay mixed with something metallic. The container was darker than I'd expected, lit only by the gray light filtering through the doorway behind me. It took my eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, I wished they hadn't. Bodies. 3 of them, arranged in neat rows like cargo. Robert Chen lay closest to the door, his face gray and sunken, eyes staring at nothing. Michael Torres was next to him, still wearing that bandana he'd never taken off. Paul Rodriguez was at the far end, his lucky coin still hanging around his neck, tarnished black now. But it was the movement that made me stumble backward. Rats, dozens of them, fat and bold, scurrying over the bodies with wet, scratching sounds. Their claws scraped against the metal floor as they moved, creating that rhythmic noise I'd been hearing for days. One looked up at me with bright black eyes, a piece of something hanging from its mouth, before diving back into its feast. I pressed my hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. The scratching hadn't been Ted at all. It had been this: rats feeding on my dead crewmates while I lay in my bunk listening, thinking it was something supernatural. "You broke the third rule, Morrison." I spun around. Captain Hayes stood in the doorway, blocking my exit. His uniform was pressed, but his cold blue eyes held something I'd never seen before: satisfaction. He'd been waiting for this moment. "Staying out of restricted areas," he continued, stepping into the container. "That was rule number 3. No touching cargo containers without authorization." "You killed them." The words came out as a whisper. "You killed them all." Hayes clasped his hands behind his back, that familiar gesture that used to mean he was about to give orders. Now it looked predatory. "The ocean provides, Morrison. It always has. You just have to know how to make the right arrangements." A shadow moved behind Hayes. Ted appeared in the doorway, but something was wrong. His head tilted at a sharp, bird-like angle. His black eyes fixed on me without blinking, and when he stepped forward, his joints bent in ways that human joints don't bend. "Ted's been very helpful," Hayes said, not turning around. "Haven't you, Ted?" "Yes," Ted replied in that flat monotone, but his voice sounded different now. Hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep underwater. I backed against the far wall of the container, my foot bumping against Paul's body. The rats scattered, chittering in annoyance. Ted moved closer with those jerky mechanical steps, his head swiveling to track my movement. I had to get out, had to get to the radio. I feinted left, then dove right, shouldering past Hayes and bursting out of the container. My feet hit the deck running, and I heard Hayes shout behind me, but I was already sprinting toward the bridge. The radio equipment was there. If I could just reach it, send out a mayday call, get someone to know what was happening on this ship. The bridge door was unlocked. I slammed it behind me and threw the bolt, buying myself maybe 30 seconds. The radio console sat against the far wall, its dials and switches looking more complicated than I remembered. I grabbed the microphone and started flipping switches, praying I could remember the emergency frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is cargo vessel." I realized I didn't even know our ship's name. Hayes had never told us. "This is a cargo vessel in the Gulf of Alaska. We have multiple crew deaths. Captain has murdered the crew. Request immediate assistance." The door shook as something heavy slammed against it. Hayes' voice came through the wood, calm and controlled. "Open the door, Morrison. You're only making this harder on yourself." I kept transmitting, giving our approximate coordinates based on what I could see on the navigation charts. The bolt was starting to bend under the repeated impacts. I had maybe 10 more seconds. "Repeat. This is a cargo vessel requesting immediate assistance. Captain William Hayes has murdered crew members Robert Chen, Michael Torres, and Paul Rodriguez. Something is wrong with crew member Tay." The door exploded inward as Hayes burst through, a heavy wrench in his hand. He brought it down on the radio console in one swift motion, sparks flying as the equipment died with electronic whine. The microphone went dead in my hand. "Stupid boy," Hayes said, breathing hard. "You have no idea what you've done." Ted appeared behind him in the doorway. Up close I could see his skin had a waxy quality, yellowed and smooth like old candle wax that had been melted and reformed. When he turned his head to look at me, it rotated almost completely around. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from its mount on the wall and swung it at Ted's head with everything I had. The metal canister connected with a wet thud, and Ted's head snapped to the side at an impossible angle. But he didn't fall. He didn't even stagger. Instead, he turned his head back to face me, that broken neck rotating like it was on a swivel. No blood, no pain, just those black eyes staring at me. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. backing toward the bridge windows. Ted lunged forward with sudden, inhuman speed. I dodged sideways and he crashed into the navigation table, scattering charts across the floor. I ran for the door, but Hayes blocked my path, swinging the wrench at my head. I ducked and felt the wind from it ruffle my hair. The emergency flare locker was mounted near the bridge entrance. I yanked it open and grabbed 3 flares, pulling the first one's ignition cord as I stumbled backward onto the deck. The flare burst to life with a brilliant red light, and I fired it high into the gray morning sky. Hayes tackled me before I could light the second one, driving me down onto the metal deck. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and the remaining flares scattered across the deck. Hayes's weight pinned me down, his hands wrapping around my throat. "You don't understand," he said, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like seawater and something rotten. "I've kept this ship safe for 15 years. 15 years without losing a single man to the ocean's hunger. Do you know what that takes?" I managed to get the second flare's cord and pulled it. The flare ignited between us, its red light blazing in Hayes's face. He jerked back, momentarily blinded, and I rolled away, grabbing the third flare. "I made a deal," Hayes continued, wiping his eyes. "The old things that live in the deep places, they need to feed. They've always needed to feed, but they're reasonable. A few crew members every voyage, and they let the rest of us pass safely through their territory." The third flare burst to life, and I sent it arcing into the sky, its red trail cutting through the morning air like a distress signal. Maybe someone would see it. Maybe someone would come. Ted had recovered from his collision with the navigation table. He moved toward me again, but his movements were even more wrong now. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and his head still tilted too far to one side. But he kept coming, those black eyes never leaving my face. "Ted was the first," Hayes said, getting to his feet and brushing off his uniform. "Fell overboard 3 days into the voyage, but they sent him back to me, wearing his skin like a suit. He's been very useful for collecting the others." Ted's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was cold, and his fingers felt wrong, too long, with joints in places where joints shouldn't be. I tried to pull away, but his strength was inhuman. "The thing is, Morrison," Hayes continued, "you've upset the arrangement. That radio call of yours, those flares. Someone might come looking, and my partners don't like unexpected visitors." Ted's other hand reached for my throat, moving with that same mechanical precision. I could see now that his fingernails had grown longer, sharpened to points like claws. Up close, the sweet smell of decay was overwhelming. I drove my knee up into Ted's stomach as hard as I could. He doubled over but didn't release his grip. Instead, he made a sound, a wet, gurgling noise that no human throat should have been able to produce. Hayes stepped closer, the wrench still in his hand. "The old ones are patient, but they're not forgiving. They've been feeding in these waters since before men learned to build ships, and they'll be feeding long after the last human drowns." Ted straightened up, his head rotating back to that impossible angle. When he opened his mouth, I could see that his teeth had changed too, rows of sharp, triangular points like a shark's. Black water dripped from between them, pooling on the deck at his feet. I broke free from Hayes's grip and lunged toward the emergency equipment locker mounted near the bridge. My hands shook as I fumbled with the latches, but I managed to yank it open and grab the bright orange emergency beacon inside. The device was about the size of a football, heavy and solid in my hands. "What are you doing?" Hayes shouted behind me, his voice cracking with panic. I didn't answer. I activated the beacon with a sharp twist of the top section, hearing the satisfying click as the signal began transmitting. The small LED light on top started flashing red, sending out our position to any Coast Guard vessels or aircraft in range. Hayes lunged toward me, but I was already moving. I sprinted to the port railing and hurled the beacon as far as I could into the dark water. It hit the surface with a splash and immediately began floating, the red light blinking steadily as it bobbed in the waves. "You stupid son of a bitch!" Hayes screamed, his face twisted with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ted had been standing motionless during the struggle, but now his head snapped toward Hayes with that unnatural bird-like motion. Hayes pointed at me with a shaking finger. "Kill him," Hayes ordered, his voice cold and final. "Kill him now." I backed away along the railing, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. Ted moved faster now, his joints bending at wrong angles as he closed the distance between us. When he was just a few feet away, he lunged forward with inhuman speed, those claw-like fingers reaching for my throat. I threw myself to the side at the last second. Ted's momentum carried him past me, and I grabbed his shoulders and shoved him hard toward the railing. His body hit the metal barrier with a dull clang, and for a moment he teetered there, those black eyes staring at me with no expression at all. Then I gave him one final push. Ted went over the side without a sound. I rushed to the railing and looked down, watching his body hit the churning water below. The moment the salt water touched him, something incredible happened. His skin began to dissolve, peeling away in gray sheets that dispersed in the waves. Whatever had been animating Ted Kowalski's body couldn't survive contact with the ocean that had created it. Within seconds, there was nothing left but empty clothes floating on the surface. "You killed him," Hayes said behind me, his voice filled with disbelief. "You killed my partner." I turned to face him. Hayes had pulled a knife from somewhere, a long fishing blade with a serrated edge. His hands were steady now, and his eyes had gone completely cold. "Doesn't matter," he continued, advancing slowly. "I'll just tell them you went crazy. Killed the crew, attacked me, had to defend myself." He smiled, showing yellowed teeth. Tragic accident. Sole survivor barely escaped with his life. I backed away from him, scanning the deck for anything I could use to defend myself. My hand closed around the wooden handle of a boat hook that was secured to the railing nearby. I yanked it free just as Hayes lunged forward with the knife. The boat hook was about 4 feet long with a metal point and hook at the end. I swung it like a baseball bat, catching Hayes in the chest before he could get close enough to use the knife. The metal point punched through his shirt and into his ribs with a wet thud. Hayes stumbled backward, the knife falling from his hand as he clutched at the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark in the deck lighting. He took another step back, his face pale with shock. His heel caught on a metal cleat bolted to the deck. Hayes went down hard, the back of his head striking the cleat with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. His body went limp instantly, arms falling to his sides. Blood began pooling beneath his skull, spreading across the wet deck. I stood there for a long moment, the boat hook still in my hands, staring at Hayes's motionless form. The only sounds were the engine humming below and the waves against the hull. The emergency beacon continued flashing in the distance, a tiny red light bobbing on the dark water. I was alone. The realization stopped me cold. 7 crew members had started this voyage, and now I was the only one left alive. The others were either dead in that container or transformed into something inhuman and fed to whatever lived in the deep water. I dropped the boat hook and walked slowly to the bridge. The radio was destroyed, but the navigation equipment still worked. I studied the charts Hayes had been using, trying to figure out our position and the nearest port. We were somewhere in the Gulf of Alaska, maybe 2 days from Anchorage if I could maintain course and speed. I'd never piloted a ship this size before, but I'd worked on fishing boats back in Maine. The principles were the same, just on a larger scale. I adjusted our heading toward the coast and locked the autopilot, then went below to check the engine room. Everything seemed to be running normally. Back on deck, I could still see the emergency beacon flashing in the distance. Coast Guard vessels monitored those frequencies constantly. Someone would come looking for us. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and constant vigilance. I stayed on the bridge, checking our position every few minutes and scanning the horizon for other ships. I didn't dare go near the containers or sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. Every shadow on deck made me jump. Every sound from below made me grab the boat hook I'd kept close by. The sun was setting on the second day when I spotted the Coast Guard cutter on the horizon. The white hull with the distinctive orange stripe was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I fired the remaining flares from the emergency locker, sending bright red streaks across the darkening sky. The cutter reached us just as full darkness fell. Powerful searchlights swept across our deck as the larger vessel pulled alongside. I could see uniformed figures moving on their deck preparing to board. "This is the United States Coast Guard," a voice called through a loudspeaker. "Identify yourself and state your emergency." "Daniel Morrison," I shouted back. "Crew member on this cargo vessel. Multiple casualties. I'm the only survivor." A boarding party of 4 officers came across on a small boat. They were armed and cautious, treating the situation as potentially hostile until they could assess what had happened. The team leader was a lieutenant commander named Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Where's the rest of your crew?" she asked as soon as she stepped onto our deck. I led them to the container where the bodies were stored. Rodriguez took one look inside and immediately called for additional personnel and a crime scene team. The rats had been busy during the past few days, but the bodies were still recognizable. "Jesus Christ," one of the younger officers muttered, covering his nose against the smell. "And the captain?" Rodriguez asked. I showed them Hayes's body near the cleat where he'd fallen. The blood had dried to a dark stain on the deck, and his skin had taken on a waxy pallor in the cold air. "I killed him," I said simply. "Self-defense. He was trying to murder me." Rodriguez studied the scene carefully, taking photographs and making notes. She had me walk through everything that had happened, starting from Ted going overboard and ending with Hayes's death. I told her about the rules, the disappearing crew members, Ted's transformation, and the things I'd seen at the stern during the red light incidents. "That's quite a story," Rodriguez said when I finished. Her tone was neutral, neither believing nor dismissing what I'd told her. "Check the container," I said. "Look at the bodies. Ask yourself how 3 men ended up locked in there with dozens of rats." The crime scene team worked through the night, documenting everything and collecting evidence. They found Hayes's key ring with the container keys, the destroyed radio equipment, and the blood evidence from his washing the morning after Chen's supposed accident. By dawn, they'd transferred me to the Coast Guard cutter. I sat in a small cabin, wrapped in a blanket and drinking coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the bitter sludge we'd been making on the cargo ship. Through the porthole, I could see our vessel being towed behind us, heading for port and a full investigation. Rodriguez sat across from me, a digital recorder on the table between us. "We'll need a complete statement when we reach port," she said. "The FBI will want to interview you as well. This is going to be a complex investigation." I nodded, too tired to care about the bureaucracy that was coming. "What happens to the ship?" "Evidence. It'll be impounded until we can figure out exactly what happened out there." She paused, studying my face. "You really believe your crewmate came back from the dead?" "I know how it sounds," I said, "but I saw what I saw. Ted Kowalski died when he went overboard. Whatever came back wearing his face wasn't human." Rodriguez made a note in her file. "The medical examiner will determine cause of death for all the victims. We'll know more then." I stared out the porthole at the gray water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, things moved in the deep places that were older than human civilization. Hayes had made a deal with them, trading lives for safe passage. Now that arrangement was broken, and I was the only one left to tell the story. The Coast Guard cutter's engines hummed steadily as we headed toward port, carrying me away from the nightmare that had consumed 6 men and left me as the sole witness to their fate.